Welcome to WikiPodcast.
Hello.
Today marks the start of, well, a pretty fascinating mini-series we're calling Enlightenment, German Idealism, and Beyond.
Sounds ambitious.
It is. And in this first deep dive, our mission, really, is to unpack the critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant.
Ah, Kant.
A big one.
Absolutely. A thinker who fundamentally reshaped how we understand what we can know about reality, that's metaphysics for you, and crucially, how we should act ethics.
And for this exploration, we're leaning heavily on the comprehensive Wikipedia entry for Immanuel Kant. It really gives a solid foundation,
Yeah.
Covers his life, the key ideas, his massive influence.
Yeah, it's a great starting point. And for you, the learner, our listener, we're aiming to pull out the essentials, those aha moments from Kant's, let's face it, sometimes complex work.
Right, cut through the jargon a bit.
Exactly. We want clarity without getting too bogged down, understand the core, and importantly, why Kant still matters so much today. Okay, ready to dive in?
Let's do it. Right, so Immanuel Kant. He was born Immanuel Kant with an E back in 1724. In Königsberg, which was East Prussia then, now it's Kaliningrad in Russia.
And he lived a remarkably long and consistent life there, passed away in 1804.
And that name change, Immanuel to Immanuel, apparently happened after he learned some Hebrew. Interesting little detail.
It is, and he's just such a central figure of the Enlightenment, isn't he? That whole era championing reason, individual thought.
You really have to keep that context in mind, yeah. His ideas were definitely a product of and a reaction to his time.
His upbringing, though, was quite strict, deeply rooted in pietist values.
Which meant?
Well, intense religious devotion, humility, a very literal take on the Bible. His early education, surprisingly perhaps, focused more on Latin and religion than, say, math or science.
Huh. You wouldn't necessarily expect that given his later work.
No, but that discipline might have shaped him. Think of that famous story about his routine. So precise, apparently, that people in Königsberg set their clocks by his afternoon walk.
The human clock. And he never married, did he? Though apparently he wasn't a total hermit.
Not at all. He had a social life, was a popular lecturer long before his major philosophical works came out, but yeah, remained a bachelor. Clearly sharp from a young age, though.
Collegium Fridericianum, then the University of Königsberg.
Where he basically spent his entire academic career.
Right. And there he studied under Martin Nutzen, who was pretty influential. Nutzen knew his Leibniz and Wolff, the dominant German rationalists, but he also knew British philosophy, Newtonian physics, and crucially, he steered Kant away from some popular ideas.
Like what?
Like the theory of pre-established harmony, this idea that mind and body don't interact but run in perfect sync like two clocks set by God, and also away from traditional idealism, the view that reality is purely mental.
So Nutzen exposed him to different streams of thought and maybe planted some seeds for Kant's own unique path.
I think so. That mix of rationalism, empiricism, and science was vital for what became Kant's transcendental idealism. It didn't come out of nowhere. Okay, this is where it starts getting really fascinating for me. Even before the big critiques, Kant was doing science, real science.
Absolutely. Like his work on the moon's gravity slowing Earth's spin. He even figured out tidal locking, why we always see the same face of the moon. Pretty impressive.
And then there's the nebular hypothesis in 1755. His book, Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens.
Groundbreaking stuff. He proposed the solar system formed from a giant gas cloud, a nebula.
Which is essentially the model we still use today, more or less.
Pretty much. And he went further, suggesting the Milky Way is a disk of stars. And get this, that other fuzzy patches, other nebulae, might be distant galaxies. Just wow.
So he's thinking about origins, structures, vast systems. You can almost see a parallel with how he later approached the mind, right? Looking for the underlying structures that shape things.
That's a great point. A structural way of thinking, definitely. And after this early scientific work, he settled into lecturing at the university. Taught everything: math, physics, logic, metaphysics.
And later ethics, anthropology, natural law. A wide range.
A true polymath. But then came David Hume.
Ah, Hume, the great skeptic.
Exactly. And Kant himself famously said Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. Meaning Hume's sharp questions about things we take for granted, like cause and effect, or even knowing if there's an external world, really forced Kant to rethink everything. It jolted him out of accepting philosophical traditions unquestioningly.
So Hume's skepticism was the catalyst for Kant's own massive philosophical project.
Very much so. Kant saw the power of Hume's arguments, but worried they led to, well, undermining science and maybe even morality. So his critical project aimed to respond to that skepticism.
But without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, he wanted to preserve scientific knowledge.
Precisely. And this leads us right to his central philosophical aim. How do you protect human autonomy, our freedom, the basis for morality, from a scientific worldview that seemed increasingly deterministic, mechanistic?
That's the big tension he's trying to resolve.
It is, and he framed his whole philosophy around three core questions. What can I know? What should I do? And what may I hope?
And the monster work, the critique of pure reason, is mostly tackling that first one. What can I know?
That's the main focus, yes. And in it, he launches his Copernican revolution in philosophy.
Okay, explain that. Like Copernicus changing our view of the solar system.
Exactly the analogy Kant used. Just as Copernicus said the Earth moves around the sun, not the other way around, Kant flipped perspective on knowledge. Instead of assuming our minds passively conform to objects out there, he proposed that objects, as we experience them, actually conform to the structure of our minds. Our minds actively shape our experience.
So we don't just receive information, we organize it.
Fundamentally organize it through what he called our forms of intuition, space and time, and the categories of the understanding. These are like the mind's built-in operating system.
And this is how we can have knowledge that isn't just from experience, a priori knowledge.
That's the claim. Because the structures are ours, we can know certain things about any possible experience before we have it. This whole idea is called transcendental idealism.
Okay, transcendental idealism. Let's unpack that slightly. You mentioned space and time as forms of intuition.
Right. Think of them not as containers objects exist in, but more like mental frameworks or lenses through which we perceive everything. They structure all our sensory input.
So they aren't properties of the world itself independently of us.
According to Kant, no. They're how we must experience the world. They are, as he puts it, transcendentally ideal, meaning they originate in our sensibility, our capacity to be affected by objects.
But hang on, space and time feel pretty real when I bump into a table.
Ah, yes. And Kant agrees. He also says they are empirically real, meaning within the realm of our experience, everything necessarily appears in space and time. They are the universal conditions of our reality.
Okay, so ideal in origin, but real in experience. That's a tricky distinction.
It is subtle, but it leads to another key idea. The distinction between appearances, the world as we experience it through our mental structures, the phenomenal world,
Right.
and things in themselves, reality, as it might be independent of our minds, the noumenal world.
And these things in themselves.
Kant argues their ultimate nature is unknowable to us. We only ever access the world as it appears to us, filtered through our intuition and understanding.
So this was Kant's answer to skepticism, like Hume's, by grounding some knowledge not in experience, but in the mind's own structure.
Exactly. He's trying to find a path between rationalism, reason alone gives knowledge, and empiricism, only experience gives knowledge. For Kant, you absolutely need both.
Sensibility provides the raw data, the intuitions.
And understanding provides the concepts to organize that data, to make sense of it. You need both working together. That's where his famous line comes in. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind.
They're partners in creating knowledge.
Indispensable partner.
Okay, so if that's the general framework, how did he drill down into how we actually form knowledge, how judgments work?
Right. He makes some more crucial distinctions. First, between a priori knowledge, independent of experience, necessary and universal.
Like math, maybe.
He thought so, yes. And a posteriori knowledge derived from experience, contingent.
Okay.
Then he distinguishes between analytic judgments and synthetic judgments.
Analytic is where the predicate just unpacks the subject, like bachelors or unmarried men.
Precisely. Trivial, in a sense. But synthetic judgments are where the predicate adds something new, something not contained in the subject concept, like the cat is on the mat.
That comes from experience, a posteriori.
Usually, yes. But Kant throws a spanner in the works. He asks what he sees as the central question of his critique. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible?
How can we know something new about the world, necessarily and universally, without deriving it from experience? Seems impossible.
It seems impossible based on the old assumptions. But Kant believed we do have such knowledge. He points to mathematics, like 7 plus 5 equals 12. He argued 12 isn't contained in 7 plus 5. And even fundamental principles of physics.
So the critique is basically his explanation for how this is possible.
Yes, through his transcendental framework. The mind imposes structures that make synthetic a priori knowledge about the form of experience possible.
Going back to those two stems, sensibility and understanding.
Exactly. Sensibility gives us particulars, intuitions. Understanding gives us general concepts to think about those particulars.
And in the part of the critique called the Transcendental Analytic, he focuses on the understanding.
Correct. He asks, what are the fundamental concepts, the pure concepts that the understanding uses to organize experience? He calls these the categories.
Like substance, causality, unity, things like that.
Those are key examples. He derived a table of 12 categories he believed were exhaustive and necessary for any possible thought about objects.
Then comes the transcendental deduction of the categories. Sounds intimidating.
It's famously difficult, but the core idea is an argument for why these categories must apply to any object we can possibly experience.
How does he argue that?
He links it to the unity of consciousness, what he calls the transcendental unity of apperception. Basically, the fact that all my experiences are my experiences belonging to a single, unified I think, requires that these experiences are structured according to these common rules, the categories. Without them, experience would just be a meaningless slideshow, not a coherent world.
So the categories are the conditions for having a unified self that has experiences at all.
That's the crux of the deduction. They make experience possible, so they must apply to all experience.
Wow, okay, so our minds aren't passive cameras. They're active organizers using these built-in categories.
Precisely. Then, in the Analytic of Principles, he explores how these pure concepts apply to actual empirical judgments. This involves something called schematism.
Schematism.
Yeah, think of it as the bridge. How do abstract concepts like causality connect to the flow of our actual perceptions in time? The schema is like a rule the imagination uses to apply the pure category to sensory input, often involving time.
Making the abstract concrete in a way.
Sort of. And within this section, we get the really important analogies of experience.
Let's tackle it.
Fundamental principles about time relations and experience. First, the principle of the persistence of substance change requires something underlying that persists through change.
Okay.
Second, the principle of temporal succession according to the law of causality. This is his big answer to Hume.
Right. Hume said, we just see events following each other. We don't see necessary connection.
But Kant argues that for us to experience an objective succession event, B, truly following event A, not just subjective perception, our understanding must presuppose necessary causal laws connecting them. Causality is a rule the mind imposes to make objective time order possible.
So causality isn't just habit. It's a precondition for experiencing objective time.
According to Kant, yes. And third, the principle of simultaneity, or community things existing at the same time in space, must be in mutual interaction.
So these analogies ground fundamental physics principles not just in observation, but in the mind's necessary structure.
Exactly. They show how the categories shape our understanding of a unified, law-governed empirical world.
But Kant was also famously critical of trying to go beyond experience, wasn't he? That brings us to the transcendental dialectic.
Yes, the negative part of the critique. Here, he warns about the limits of reason. Reason naturally seeks completeness, ultimate unity. It pushes beyond the boundaries of possible experience.
It gets into trouble.
Big trouble. It generates illusions and contradictions. Reason creates what Kant calls ideas like the soul, the world as a complete whole, and God.
Are these ideas useless then?
Not entirely. He says they can't be objects of knowledge because they don't correspond to any possible intuition, but they have a vital regulative use.
Meaning?
They guide our scientific inquiry, pushing us towards greater unity and completeness in our understanding, even if we never reach the final goal. They act as ideals.
But we shouldn't mistake them for things we can actually know or prove through pure reason alone.
Absolutely not. And in the dialectic, he systematically dismantles attempts to do just that. He critiques rational psychology, trying to prove things about the soul, like its simplicity or immortality, purely through reason. He exposes fallacies he calls paralogisms.
Okay.
Then he critiques rational cosmology reason, trying to grasp the universe as a totality. This leads to the famous antinomies of pure reason,
where reason seems to prove contradictory things, like the universe had a beginning in time, and it didn't.
Exactly. 4 sets of these contradictions showing reason gets tied in knots when it leaves the ground of experience.
And finally, he critiques rational theology.
Yes, he examines the traditional philosophical arguments for God's existence, the ontological argument from the concept of God, the cosmological from contingency, and the physico-theological from design. He argues none of them work as strict logical proofs based on pure reason.
So the critique of pure reason sets the limits of what we can know, securing science within those limits, but showing the pretensions of metaphysics beyond those limits.
That's a very good summary. It clears the ground, in a way.
Clears the ground for what?
Well, partly for his moral philosophy. By showing the limits of theoretical reason, especially regarding things like freedom and God, he makes space for practical reason.
Moving to the second big question. What should I do?
Exactly. Kant's ethics, laid out in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, the critique of practical reason, and later works, it's just as revolutionary.
What's the starting point for Kantian ethics?
The goodwill. Kant famously says, nothing is good without qualification except a goodwill.
Not happiness, not intelligence, not courage.
Nope, those can all be used for bad ends. The only purely good thing is the will that chooses to act out of duty, simply because it's the right thing to do, according to the moral law.
Acting from duty, not just in accordance with duty. That's a key distinction for him, isn't it?
Crucial. Doing the right thing because you feel like it or because it benefits you doesn't have true moral worth for Kant. Only doing it because it's your duty does.
And where does this duty, this moral law, come from?
From reason itself. It's not imposed from outside, not from God or society or desire. It's a law that rational beings give to themselves autonomously.
Autonomy. Freedom. That's central again.
Absolutely. He distinguishes between transcendental freedom, a complex metaphysical idea about being able to start causal chains, and practical freedom, our ability as rational beings to act independently of our immediate desires and impulses, to follow the dictates of reason. That practical freedom is the bedrock of morality.
And this leads directly to the categorical imperative.
The most famous part of his ethics? It's the fundamental principle of morality, unlike hypothetical imperatives.
Which are if-then commands. Like,
Yeah.
if you want to pass the exam, then you should study.
Right. They depend on a desired end. The categorical imperative is different. It's unconditional. It just says do X or don't do Y, period. Because reason demands it. It's binding on all rational beings, everywhere, always.
And he gave different formulations of it, right? They're supposed to be equivalent.
He claimed they were different ways of saying the same thing. The most famous is the formula of universal law.
Which is?
Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
Okay, break that down. What's a maxim?
Your personal principle or rule for acting in a certain situation. Like, when I need money, I will borrow it, promising to repay even though I know I can't. That's a maxim.
And the test is, can I will that everyone adopt this maxim?
Yes. Could you rationally want a world where everyone makes false promises when they need money? Kant argues no. The very institution of promising would collapse. It creates a contradiction.
So, if universalizing your maxim leads to a contradiction, the action is morally forbidden.
Either a contradiction in conception, the maxim is unthinkable as a universal law, or a contradiction in the will. You couldn't rationally will such a world even if it's conceivable, like a world where no one ever helps anyone else.
Okay. What's the next formulation?
The formula of humanity as end in itself. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end.
Treat people as ends, not just tools.
Exactly. Respect their inherent dignity, their capacity for rationality and autonomy. Don't just use them to get what you want. That false promise example, you're using the lender merely as a means to get money and not respecting their rational agency.
This formulation feels very influential. It emphasizes respect for persons.
Hugely influential. It's often seen as the grounding for modern human rights concepts.
And the third one, formula of autonomy.
This emphasizes that the moral law isn't imposed externally. It's the law that we, as rational beings, legislate for ourselves. We are the authors of the moral law we are bound by. It links morality directly to our freedom.
So, universal law checks consistency, humanity checks respect, autonomy highlights freedom,
Yeah,
all pointing to the same rational requirements.
that's the idea. Later in the metaphysics of morals, especially the doctrine of virtue, he gets into more specific duties. Duties to oneself, like developing your talents, and duties to others, like benevolence, promoting their happiness. He talks about ends that are at the same time duties. It adds a bit more substance, maybe a slightly more goal-oriented feel than the pure formalism of the groundwork.
Still grounded in the categorical imperative, though.
Oh, yes, always derived from that fundamental principle.
Okay, let's try to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this. Kant's work seems like a watershed moment.
Absolutely monumental in epistemology, metaphysics, ethics. He fundamentally changed the questions philosophers ask and the way they try to answer them. Transcendental idealism, the synthetic a priori, the categorical imperative, autonomy. These are concepts that echo through all subsequent Western philosophy.
Influencing German idealists who came right after him, like Hegel, but also Marx, phenomenology, existentialism. The list goes on.
And even beyond pure philosophy, his ideas on perpetual peace based on republican states and international cooperation foreshadow things like democratic peace theory, just incredibly far-reaching.
Okay, let's try and unpack what this all really means, especially for you, the learner. Kant's critical philosophy, it's what is a huge shift, isn't it? He challenged everything.
He really did. He offered this framework that, on the one hand, gives a powerful role to the human mind in actually structuring our reality, how we experience things. We're not just passive receivers.
Right, the Copernican revolution.
Exactly. And on the other hand, in ethics, he grounds morality not in fuzzy feelings or divine commands, but in the firm bedrock of reason itself, a universal law we discover through thought.
And that law demands respect. Respect for the rationality and autonomy in every single person. That feels incredibly relevant today.
It absolutely is. So for you listening, hopefully this deep dive has given you a kind of map, a shortcut into some incredibly powerful philosophical ideas. Understanding Kant, even the basics, gives you a foundation for exploring so much more. His work is still debated, still inspires, still challenges.
Which brings us to a final thought, maybe something for you to chew on. If Kant is right, if our minds actively structure our experience, what does that really mean for our concept of objective truth? Can we ever know reality as it is?
And on the ethics side, how do we ensure we are truly living up to that demand to treat everyone, including ourselves, always as an end and never merely as a means? Are we always aware of when we might be instrumentalizing others?
Deep questions, fascinating avenues that Kant opens up. Definitely worth pondering.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you and have an amazing day.